Europeans tend to say Americans are so fake. Because they're so enthusiastic. Monday morning, you've got a meeting with your American team, and the Americans are like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so happy to be here. This is great." And you're thinking, it's Monday morning, you know? This is how can you be how can this be great? Um, because in Central Western Europe, we tend to be more down to earth. Hello, we're having a meeting, so let's have the meeting. But in the United States, it is very important to show enthusiasm. Oh my gosh, I'm so happy to be here. I'm so excited to be here. Because if you do not show that enthusiasm, it basically means you're not interested.
Welcome to Transatlantic Titans, the show for Europeans making it big in America. And here is your host, Manny Schoenhuber.
Welcome to Transatlantic Titans, the show about Europeans making it big in America. I am very excited to welcome another Transatlantic Titan to the show today, all the way from the Netherlands, but now also in the US. So we took a similar path. Very excited to hear more about it. Annette van der Feltz. I hope I said that good with my German Dutch accent. Welcome to the show. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks, Manny. I'm very excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, let's dive right in.
Yeah.
Annette, tell us a little bit more about yourself. Tell us a little bit more about your story. Obviously, we're excited to learn what brought you to the US and now, obviously, how you're helping European companies in the US as they hopefully all make it big in America.
Yeah. So I am an intercultural communication coach and consultant. That doesn't mean I teach culture. I help companies expanding to the United States to become successful in the United States. Because even if there's like the smallest misalignment, that can turn into lost contracts, lost traction, missed hires, no
Lawsuits.
turnover. What's that?
Lawsuits.
I forgot. I'm talking to a lawyer. Lawsuits, definitely. And so that's what I do. I was born and raised in the Netherlands. And as a teenager, I lived in the United States with my family, my parents, my sisters, my dog, my guinea pig, for 3 years in the United States. And that kind of, that does something to you. That was very exciting. After I graduated high school in the Netherlands, the excitement of living abroad, drew me again. So I lived, worked, and studied in France, in the Netherlands, and in Sweden. I ended up marrying somebody from Sweden, and we didn't want to live in Sweden. We didn't want to live in the Netherlands. So we moved to the United States for 3 years while we tried to figure out where we did want to live. And that's 27 years ago, still here. So at one point after the birth of our second child, I stopped working and I started helping expats settle in. Just the stuff you need to do when you first move here. Driver's license, social security number, which is a number that the government gives you and uses to identify you, opening a bank account. And I helped expats doing that because when I moved here, that took so much time figuring out how to do it, where to go, what documents to bring. It cost my company a lot of money in lost hours. So I started helping expats with that. And I noticed two things, or one thing. There were two groups, and I'm making it very black and white, very unnuanced, but there were two groups of expats. There was one group that was like, well, this is silly. In my country, stuff is much more organized. Things are much better. There was the other group that was like, oh my gosh, things are so different here. What does that mean? What do I do with that? Why is it different? And so I followed these expats. And when they went on to their next assignment 3 years later, the group that was like, things are better in my country, they were, okay, goodbye. But the group that was like, why are things different? What does this mean to me? They were the ones that really got to know American culture. They didn't turn into Americans, but they got the best of their American culture and the best of their own culture and used that to be successful in their job. And their families were integrated. They had lots of friends here. They really had a wonderful time here. And that to me showed how important it is to understand the culture of the country where you are living. And it was kind of a shock because I had lived in the US, I had lived in the Netherlands, in France, in Sweden. And it's only when I was looking from the outside that understanding the culture of the country you are a guest in is really a make or break for success. So I took that and I translated that to first helping the spouses integrate into American society and then the employee, the expat. And from there, it turned into helping teams, just helping anybody who moves to the United States. And so I formed two companies. One company is Dutch American Connection, where I specifically focus on Dutch companies collaborating with Americans. But I noticed that there's a need from all over the world. So for the Dutch companies, I have Dutch American Connection, but for companies from other countries, I have the American Culture Code to help anybody doing business in the US or with Americans understand what Americans value and how to best communicate and collaborate with Americans. There you go. That was my introduction.
That's great. And I would say let's stay on topic right away because I tend to see that culture is one of the most misunderstood differences between Central Europe, countries like the Netherlands, countries like Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Denmark, to the US. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
That is such a great question because imagine you're moving to China. Everybody knows, like, oh, Chinese culture. The language is different. So, of course, you need to learn the language, but everybody knows that the customs and how people communicate with each other is very different. So they get all prepared and they take intercultural lessons and everything. But moving to the US, all these countries you just named, they speak English. They're almost fluent in English. They watch Netflix movies. Most people have been on vacation to the US and they've never really noticed any major cultural differences. Sure, the cars are bigger but nothing that really stopped them or made them pause like, oh my goodness, what's going on? So a lot of European countries tend to think, I'm fluent in English. How difficult can it be? And that is the trap. Because if you go with that mindset, if you're not open to noticing the differences, well, your message is going to land wrong, incorrectly. You may be offending people without knowing it.
Especially nowadays, yes.
Exactly. Yeah. You're not aware of that. And so that is the thing that people think like, all I have to do is translate my website, translate my presentation, and here we go, the American dream. Americans tend to have different values. They value a different way of communicating. They value a different way of doing business. They value different ways of managing, of collaborating. And that's hard to miss if you're not open to that.
So if you're willing to share some of those secrets with the audience, if you had to name 3, 4, 5 major differences between, let's keep it Central Europe, because I would say we can include countries like the Benelux and Germany, Denmark, and others into that region, where it may be misunderstood, it may be misinterpreted as compared to the US. If you had to rank 1 through 3, 4, 5, what do you see? Or maybe ask a different way, what do you see those companies or individuals coming from our countries, our home bases to the US, where are they making the biggest or most mistakes?
Oh, man, I mean, yeah, the list is much longer than 5, but I think the one thing I hear most often is, any Americans listening, I'm so sorry to say this, but Europeans tend to say Americans are so fake because they're so enthusiastic. Monday morning, you've got a meeting with your American team and the Americans are like, oh my gosh, I'm so happy to be here. This is great. And you're thinking, it's Monday morning. How can how can this be great? Because in Central Western Europe, we tend to be more down to earth. Hello, we're having a meeting, so let's have the meeting. But in the United States, it is very important to show enthusiasm. Oh my gosh, I'm so happy to be here. I'm so excited to be here. Because if you do not show that enthusiasm, it basically means you're not interested. I couldn't care less, whatever. So as a European, you're looking at this through your European lens and you're seeing this fake enthusiasm. But on the other hand, the Americans are looking at the Europeans who are going like, yeah, great meeting, let's just get started. And they're like, well, these people must not be interested because they're showing no enthusiasm. So that is the one thing where Europeans say Americans are so fake, and where I say, yes, if you look at their behavior through your Dutch lens, your German lens, your European lens, it's very fake. If a Dutch person did that, you would think they were fake. But Americans have different values. They have different ways of communicating. So take off your Dutch lens and put on your American lens, and then you understand that this is their way of showing, I want to build trust with you. I want to build a business relation with you. So that is my number one complaint that I hear from Europeans. Americans are over the top and fake. Again, they're not. It's just a different way of communicating. I would say number two, very close to number one, everything goes so fast. They're so focused on I need it now, I need it now. Because yes, in the United States, time is money. So stuff needs to happen quickly. And so very often an American will send a request to, well, when I work with the Dutch or the Swedes, like, I need this information now, where a Dutch person will be, well, that's really great, but it's 5 p.m. I've got to go home and pick up my kids. So you're going to have to wait until tomorrow. And I see you laughing. You recognize this?
Sounds familiar. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Where so Europeans are like, come on, couldn't you let me know earlier? Or yeah, I can't get this to you until, tomorrow I'm off, so I'll get this to you on Friday. In the United States, business cycles tend to be a lot shorter. If somebody needs an RFP, a request for a proposal, they usually give a very short lead time. So everybody needs to drop everything. And time is money. The clock just moves much faster in the United States than it does in Europe. So that's the second biggest difference. Gosh, I'm trying to think. Number three, I need to make a choice here between the way Americans are convinced, like how you sell something, or Americans tend to avoid confrontation. So I'm going to go with how you convince, how you sell something in the US. Before I moved to the US, I lived in Sweden and I was in business development. And whenever I would do a presentation about our product, I would, of course, talk about the product and what you can do with it and how great it is. But I would also talk about the things the product didn't do. So yeah, our product does this, but right now it doesn't do that. Like 2 versions, we're working on it, and in 2 years it will do that. I was giving a complete picture of what the product did and didn't do. When I moved to the US, I very quickly had to learn that it's not so much the product, and definitely not about what the product doesn't do. It's more about how will this product make me better? What's in it for me, with me being the customer? So, for example, if I wanted to sell you this pen in Europe, I talk about the pen. It's environmentally friendly. If I were German, I would probably give a lot of statistics. But in the United States, if I were to sell this pen, I wouldn't really talk about the pen. I would talk about, Manny, if you buy this pen, your future is going to look amazing. You're going to write so much neater, and people are going to be able to read your handwriting, and you will spend less time explaining what you wrote. It's not about the pen. It's about how this is going to change your life, the future. So, so those are a few of the biggest differences that I see. This enthusiasm, how you sell things, and how quickly things move here. And I'd like to reiterate, it's not that one is right, one is wrong, one is better, one is worse. It's just, this is how things are done in Europe, and this is how things are done in the US. And that's just how things are done. So how I help companies is to help them understand why they are done differently, and how you, as a German, a Dutch, a Swede, a French, can use these advantages or use these differences to your advantage.
I think that's the crucial point. What I also tell clients is the fact that it's not up to us to judge what's better or what's righter than
Yeah.
what we probably know or are used to. It's just different, and find appreciation in those differences. Maybe that's the path forward.
You said it beautiful. It's different and find the beauty in those, like the advantages in those differences.
And obviously, I picked up on the movie reference with sell me this pen from The Wolf of Wall Street. Also great for legal education and what not to do, as you're doing both
Ah,
in the US.
okay. Yeah. Yeah. I just happen to have a pen. I should have
No,
used my
it's great.
phone, I guess.
No, 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 no. That's fine. That's fine. That's
Yeah.
so yeah. Let's talk about. I am this European company right now, thinking about entering the US market. And I know, okay, I have to set up my US entity. I probably need a lawyer for this. I need a tax ID to open up the bank account, which means I'm going to need a tax advisor and I'll need a banker. Where
Yeah.
do you come in? And on top of that, what does the company, the European company, me in this case, typically look like, where you think, okay, this is where I can bring value, and now this is how I do bring value to those European companies?
Right, right. Well, the companies I work with are anybody from like a small company expanding to the US to multinationals. Multinationals, they have all these systems set up. So I work mostly one-on-one with expats who move here through coaching. They were successful in their home country. So let's say you're moving, you were successful in Germany. So now I help you one on one understand how you can translate this to the US, because you can't just be a successful German manager and come in and manage your American team as a German. But so all kinds of companies, but I would love to come into the process before the company even moves to the US. Yeah, unfortunately for me, but yeah, having a lawyer is one of the first people you need because the legal system is so different here. Legal system is a wonderful reflection of the American culture, or the legal system in Europe is a wonderful reflection of European culture.
How
Believe that.
so? How so from a non-lawyer? I'd like to hear that, because I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree
Yeah.
more.
Yeah. So, for example, if you look at American culture, what I like to do, and this is a bit of a lecture. If you look at American culture, where does the culture come from? Any culture, it comes from a country's history. A country's culture has been shaped by events um, that have happened. So, for example, well, let's take the United States. The first immigrants who came to the United States were the British, the English. Um, the Native Americans lived here, but the current American culture is really shaped by the first immigrants. What drove them to leave England and come here? Several factors. One of them, they weren't able to practice their religion freely. So that's why in the United States, this freedom of religion is so important, because that's what brought these English here. They heard there was a new country. They're like, yes, let's go to that new country and live there according to our values. And one value was freedom of religion. Another value was that these English, they were told by the English government that you're practicing the wrong religion. You're a farmer. You will never be more than a farmer. And in their religion, they were taught to work hard and leave the earth better than how you found it. But the way the British system worked is that you could never, yeah, you were not in charge of your destiny. So Americans came here saying, I'm going to be in charge of my destiny. Well, you can't have that if the government is creating all these laws that restrict you. So America is based, and again, it's all relative, but America is based on taking care of yourself and not having the government take care of yourself. And so you see that in the laws, and I'm very got to tread lightly here, speaking to a lawyer, but what I notice for example, in Europe is that there are a lot of laws and there's a lot of safety and security in the laws. In the United States, the laws are much looser. There's lots of personal freedom. Do you agree with
Yes,
that?
I wholeheartedly agree, and that's why I said it's always, it's one thing when your lawyer tells you that. It's a different thing when other advisors tell clients that as well. Because yes, it is truly, of course, you can make the argument that the US legal system is based on British common law, whereas the Dutch legal system, for example, or the German or Danish legal system, Swedish, are based on the French Code Civil. So you have statutory arguments versus judge-made law, so to speak, legal precedent. That is the nuanced legal argument to make, but I think you have to take the culture and the foundation of this country and saying, yes, we wanted to break away from maybe more of the government oversight to what you called the personal freedoms. And of course, you have 50 different states that interpret those personal freedoms very differently, right? And then I think still the beauty about this country for any European company thinking about the US is, yes, you have one big country, but you have 50 states to choose from, and you'll find the right state, the right region, the right system, so to speak, that fits right to you. Do you want more like the European Union? You have those options. Do you want a whole lot less like the European Union? You have those options as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that going back to culture is like such an important part of American culture is this personal freedom, which puts a lot of responsibility on yourself. You've got to take care of yourself. Nobody else is going to take care of you, especially not the government. And so that's reflected in the laws and the way things work here. Like Americans have to pay for their own retirement. If you lose your job, there is a very, very little safety net because the whole culture is all about taking care of yourself. And so that, you see in the laws where the government protects you through all the laws, and in the United States, your lawyer protects you through the contract.
Right. And again, I think we cannot stress it enough, but it doesn't matter what we think, whether one system is better than the other. You just have to acknowledge the differences. And in order, at least from a legal perspective, and you can really hone in on the cultural aspect, it also shouldn't matter, right? Whether you become successful in the US or not, whether you make it big in America or not. Acknowledging and then using those differences to your advantage.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's respecting those differences. Like you've mentioned, they're not better or worse. They're just different. And it's all very relative. It's what we think is right. Somebody else may think is the wrong way, and there's no right or wrong.
So how do you think then, because you already mentioned ideally you come in very early on as you're probably would be able to have the most impact on any market entry decisions. But as you're progressing and having those discussions with companies, do you see that sense of realization or that surprise, the unexpected culture shock, so to speak?
Absolutely. Yeah. Like I said, I'd like to come in at the beginning, like when they start thinking about going to the US. And some companies do engage me then. But a lot of companies go back to what we said at the beginning, like, it's the United States, we speak English, I've been on vacation there. How difficult can it be? A lot of companies don't engage me until they've lost contracts, lost valuable employees. And that's when they engage me. And now, wait, I'm sorry, what was the question again?
Yeah. No, I'll add a quick comment to this because
Yeah.
I think we're both on the same boat. As a lawyer, right? Sometimes I have to clean up the mess that we didn't cause and we could have prevented
Yes.
to begin with. So I think it's a very, very similar issue because again, just like companies sometimes don't appreciate the cultural differences, they certainly do not appreciate the legal differences because they say, oh, I can read a contract, right? It's not that difficult, right? So this is the thing. But the question was more about what do you see or when do you see companies realizing those cultural differences? How do they react? And what maybe culture shock realizations they experience and then you hopefully be able to help them with, such as we lost a key employee. What do we do
Yeah.
with our next employee?
Yeah. I mean, it's usually when they start collaborating, um, and they're like, well, we hired American VP of sales, and he was just not the right person, blah blah blah. And when they've lost one or two, that's when somebody will say, well, maybe you should speak to Annette. And then once we analyze what happened here, why did that person leave? They realized, like, big mistake. One thing I had happen recently is a company had hired a VP of sales, and this guy was amazing. Things were going very well. And then the VP of sales came to the Netherlands for 2 weeks. So there was a weekend in between. And so the wife of the CEO said, oh, this poor American guy, he's all by himself on a Saturday night. Why don't you invite him over for dinner? So this VP of sales came to the house of the CEO, hung out with the wife, hung out with the kids, played games with the kids, and great time. And so everything went well. And so this VP of sales went back to the US. And from there on out, the relationship went downhill very, very quickly. And so the CEO said, I don't understand what happened. Before this VP of sales came to the Netherlands, everything was great. And afterwards, things went downhill, and they ended up having to separate ways, which is also very expensive. And so I spoke to both of them, and it became so clear that dinner at the CEO's house, that was the turning point. Have you ever met somebody like, oh, hey, Manny, do you know Bob? And then you may say, oh, yeah, I know Bob. I've been to his house.
Of course.
Yeah, I've been to his house has such a different meaning in the US than in the Netherlands, because this visit was, the wife thinking, poor guy all by himself, invite him over. In the United States, there is so much more hierarchy that if you are invited to the house of somebody who is higher up in the hierarchy, you're not only invited to the house, but you meet the family. You spend time with the family. That is sending the message, you're one of us. We're buddy-buddy. We're equals now. So while the CEO thought, that was a nice dinner, the VP of sales went home and thought, I'm the CEO's best bud. We're equal now. So the VP of sales went back and thought, I am equal to the Dutch CEO. So this person was making decisions that he should have run by the CEO. But because he had been to the CEO's house, he's like, we're on the same level. I don't need this anymore. And so that just goes to illustrate that there are so many small, subtle differences that neither the American or the Dutch thought anything of this, thought that this was the turning point. But there's so many small differences there that are just invisible, and without anybody explaining, like, yes, in the United States, it is much more hierarchical than Western European countries, which tend to be much less hierarchy.
Titles really matter in the US.
Totally. I recently had a Dutch company that wanted to buy a company in the US. They really needed to expand very quickly in the US. So the best way to expand quickly is, of course, to buy a company. So they put a project manager on there. And this project manager sent emails and made phone calls and no response whatsoever. And so he sent me his emails and said, what is wrong with my email? Why am I not getting any response? And it was so obvious because it said project manager internationalization. Yeah, and that's a perfectly normal, reasonable title in the Netherlands. But in the US, a manager, McDonald's has a manager. Your local store has a manager. But if a company wants to buy another company, you don't put a manager on there. You've got to put at least a senior vice president of international expansion or something like that. So this person rewrote the email and made some slight changes and changed his title to Senior Vice President of Internationalization, and boom, got responses, phone calls were answered, and the company has just bought an American company. That just goes to show that titles mean everything here. It is so hierarchical. A CEO will not talk to a manager. The CEO will talk to a senior vice president.
Very true.
And it goes beyond titles. Hierarchy is more than just having a title. A few years ago, I worked with somebody from Ireland who moved to the United States, and she was on the management team of a very big company. Now, she needed to buy a car, and to her, a car was just, 4 wheels to get me from home to my work. So she wanted to buy, I don't know, a Honda Civic. She couldn't care less about the car. And I had to explain to her, if somebody sees somebody from the management team get out of a Honda Civic, and I'm sorry, I apologize to all Honda Civic drivers. I drive a Honda Civic, but it basically, It doesn't say management team. It says, just somebody who works there. And I had to convince her to buy a Lexus, BMW, Mercedes or something, because that is hierarchy. It's status. She needed to show that I'm on the management team. And that comes with certain status symbols that you need to have.
Yes, and a funny story actually relating to that, because I heard a similar situation with a client of mine who went to a meeting with one of their largest customers, and he actually received some questions about the financial health and well-being of the company, whether they should be concerned about, on the one hand, getting products delivered, but also about certain accounts receivable if there's an upcoming bankruptcy or a reorganization of the company. So those are the little things that we might not consider, because in countries like the Netherlands, it's perfectly normal for the CEO to ride a bicycle to work, right? Whereas,
Our former prime minister did that. Yeah.
right, so those are the differences, right? That might be
Yeah.
unaware. But as you're reflecting now, since you have a broad wealth or breadth of experience advising on the cultural differences, has that changed over the years at all? Obviously, we have a very nice word in German called zeitgeist, right? So what,
Yes.
things change with the time, and one year you have focus on one political, cultural, societal issue. Different year you may have something else. Based on your experience, has it changed as you're looking at it from a transatlantic standpoint?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. When I started with this, 2007, the world was like international collaboration, people moving to the United States was much more rare. Um, and it's become like, yeah, it's become so much normalized for global collaboration, especially, now that we do anything and everything online. Global collaboration has just, I want to use the word exploded, maybe not the right word, but has increased a lot. So I'm seeing that where I'm seeing that companies are putting a lot more emphasis on this cultural fluency, on being able to work internationally. Before there were fewer expats, there was less international collaboration, and there's really, which I think is great, a lot more international collaboration, and companies are starting to realize that having this intercultural communication skills, having these skills, is becoming much more important. And there's much more focus on that. Now, there have been things like DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which was very big during the pandemic and right after the pandemic, which had a completely different meaning in the US than in Europe. If I would tell companies like, you really need to focus on your diversity, they're like, yeah, 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 we have, a certain percentage of women. Like, no, 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 it's not men, women. It's so much more. It's ethnicity, it's neurodivergence, so much more. So I noticed that during the pandemic and right after the pandemic, I was spending a lot of time on DEI and translating American DEI to European DEI. And did a lot of work with, for example, websites where in Europe, the websites showed all kinds of happy boys and girls, but they were all blonde and blue eyed. And it's like, no, you need to add people of different ethnicities there, but also different, like, there's so many differences. Some people are in a wheelchair, some, they're perfectly capable of doing a job. You need to show that you value this diversity. So that's something that was very big, but now the pendulum has changed as the political environment has changed. So that's another zeitgeist that I've noticed. But today, I'm noticing that companies are really focusing on making these cultural differences, making them very visible, spending time and effort on them, hiring people and educating people to use these differences to their advantage. You can really leverage, whenever there's a difference, you can leverage that difference.
Yeah, so let's try to make the business case, because obviously, with every market entry from, let's say, the Netherlands, for example, into the US, there are certain costs associated with that get budgeted. How do you, or how important are you, or in what position are you to be able to convince the leaders, the decision makers of the company to say, hey, it's worth spending some US dollars, right? Not in your entire budget on exactly this, because the classic, and you probably hear it over and over again, the classic market entry is, okay, let's just set up your US entity and we'll send somebody over on an E visa or an L visa and see if we can sell some products here in the US. How
Yeah.
important do you think it is to make this business case? And how do you personally, over your almost 30 years now of doing this, able to convince those European companies to appreciate the cultural education that they receive?
So the companies that are not yet aware of it, it's very difficult because they're so focused on going there and getting all of their ducks in a row, getting everything arranged. And again, it's like, it's English. We'll speak English. So I use a lot of examples, a lot of storytelling. That's a big difference. Americans are big into storytelling. Europeans tend to be less into storytelling. So I use a lot of examples, like the example of the onboarding, just a lot of examples. There's some examples that everybody or that a lot of companies know. So I use those examples. Imagine how much money you can save. I'm like an insurance policy. It's just a small amount of money that you invest. And it's very little time compared to everything else, but it helps, it protects your investment. You need a very big bag of money to go to the United States. I mean, just the cost of a lawyer is more expensive. The cost of real estate, getting an office, the cost of hiring somebody. It's so expensive. Don't you want to protect that with a small investment in intercultural communication? And usually it's like, no, my cousins lived in the US and, my cousin will help me. But the more I, I show, I tell them stories about where things go wrong, then they can make the connection. It's just such a small investment to protect this huge investment.
So maybe one example that we can talk about, because that has come up on the show quite a few times, is local management, boots on the ground versus managing from Europe, or just sending someone over from Europe trying to manage the Americans, quote unquote, without any of the cultural training that, for example, you'd be able to provide. Your thoughts?
My thoughts. Well, how much time do you have?
All the time you need.
But I'll try to keep it short. First of all, sales. In sales, it's so important that you've got a local who's got a feel for the market, who's got the network. Having a network is so important, but who also understands how to sell. So when it comes to sale, unless you have this exceptional salesperson, your home country, I would say hire an American because they know the market. They know the little tips and tricks. They've got this feeling. They've got the network. But a lot of companies send over somebody from the Dutch or the European headquarters to the US, which is great because that sends a message to the Americans like this company is serious. They're sending over, you've got to send over somebody who is high level. Don't send over just somebody. It's got to be somebody who is high level because that signals to the Americans that you're serious about this. You're sending the CEO or you're sending somebody from the management team. But that person, usually companies say, well, we want to have a Dutch culture, which is great, which is absolutely great. But you can't just come to the United States and say, we're going to have a Dutch culture. So now everybody's going to be direct. We're going to talk to each other very directly. That was a bad presentation. I don't think you did a good job there. That's not going to fly in the United States. In the United States, people tend to avoid confrontation. So it's so important that when you send somebody over, that they realize that managing Americans is not the same as managing the Dutch. So to answer your question, I am a very big supporter of sending somebody over here just so they can be the liaison between the US and the European company. It sends a message to the American clients like, yes, we're serious. We're not just trying something from our basement in the Netherlands. But it's so important that this person realizes that even though we are a Dutch company, we need to set up an American entity, which means one thing that I always hear is the Americans are like, we need a personnel handbook. And the Dutch are like, personnel handbook? What does that mean? And so they write this little piece of paper saying, okay, you get so many vacation days, you're off on Independence on July 4th, and you're off on this and this. Here's your personnel handbook. No, get somebody local who understands what is needed. Um, don't just take, for example, I recently had a wonderful assignment where a Dutch company had this whole performance review process. And so what they did is they ran it through Google Translate, send it over to the Americans and said, here's your performance review. I can tell by your reaction that, yeah, that's not how we do performance reviews here. So it's so important to understand that, yes, it's great to bring your Dutch culture, but the structure and the laws and the way things are done here are so differently. Be open to that. Be curious to that. Have somebody local translate. If this is the culture you want, have somebody local say, all right, well, this is how you can slowly implement this Dutch culture or this European culture.
I'd also like to get your thought on looking at the other way around, because what I see many of my Dutch clients, many of my German clients do is also celebrate the cultures and how excited the American employees are. For example, Dutch clients or subsidiaries of Dutch entities here in the US celebrating King's Day.
Yeah.
Subsidiaries of German companies celebrating Oktoberfest, things like that, where you actually then, on the one hand, you show the appreciation of the Europeans, as you explained, coming to the US and adapting to those cultures, but then also educating the Americans on the cultural, sometimes celebrations. You also mentioned the Irish, right? St. Patrick's Day, all these celebrations that we have in Europe and that we cherish in Europe, to open up the Americans for it. Because if there's a good party, I think the Americans are always in for it, right? Of course, we're
Exactly.
generalizing, but
I mean, that's the thing with culture. It's all generalizations. It's all relative. It's all very generalized, but it's a way to start a conversation. And I find that American companies or American employees really appreciate getting this little taste of what life is like at the headquarters. And they're proud to work for a Dutch company, and they start to feel a little bit Dutch because it's very interesting. It's something new. It's something fun.
and you do that with your customers maybe as well, right? One of my actual Bavarian clients, they invite customers over to Germany, to Munich for Oktoberfest every year. And of course, they all have a blast. They get the lederhosen, and I can only imagine. I've never been to, but a mutual friend of ours has invited me to King's Day in Amsterdam quite a few times. I just have to make it. But I would expect that it's a very similar experience that people will have and get to enjoy, while, as you just said it, also getting to know where are we coming from? What's the focus of the company? How do we appreciate the Dutch culture, the Bavarian culture, things like that? And at the same time, if you're inviting your customers over, do business while you're doing that. The relationship aspect, maybe more so than here is the pen. This is a great pen, 10 centimeters, whatever, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Like giving them this little taste of whatever country you're from really builds a relationship. And in the United States, business is done much more on relationship building than in the Netherlands. No judgment there. I'm not saying one is better than the others, but Americans really um they buy products built on the relationship that they have with the product. And so that is a very important point, bringing over your customers and showing them, giving them a tour of the factory. And I don't know if you want to invite them over for King's Day, because that's quite the party.
I have to sign a waiver of liability, I'll tell you that.
Spoken like a true lawyer, right? Signing a
Free
waiver.
legal advice here, yeah. Also for
Yeah.
Oktoberfest.
There you go. Yeah. No, but like, and that's when I do onboarding or I help organize these, or I consult with, we're bringing over customers or we're bringing over new employees. And I do a lot of consulting there and showing, right now the tulips full bloom. Got to go and see that. And actually is visiting the tulips or doing a boat ride through the canals in Amsterdam. That's where the real business tends to be done.
Right.
The relationships, like a lot of business, well, maybe not so much business, but that's where you really connect with your customer and you show them, this is my home country. This is how we do it here. That creates such a competitive advantage
And
if
I
it's
think
done right.
sometimes us Europeans tend to underestimate how easy it is to convince American customers to travel over to Europe, right? Because Americans, from a tourism perspective, are in love with the diversity,
Yeah.
landscape, and cultural aspects. Sure, sometimes they have to struggle with language aspects in certain parts of Europe, but it usually doesn't take much to convince an American executive or manager to fly over to Europe. And especially if you put a nice program together for them, it's a
Yeah.
relationship builder that sometimes is, in my opinion, underestimated. The power of it.
Exactly, exactly. And Europeans tend to think like, okay, they're coming here, we're showing them tulips, we're showing them the canals, and then they fly back. But it's not showing them the tulips, it's not showing them the canals. It's building this relationship. And in the United States, business is done by building a relationship. The product is nice, but somebody will stay with a customer because they have a good relationship. And it's that thing that is quite often forgotten to build into these programs. So don't rush through the tulip fields. No, take your time. Like if a tour of the tulip fields takes an hour, block 2-3 hours. Make sure there's that time to connect because that's when you do business. And in Europe, business is done in the office, in the boardroom, whatever. And this aspect is quite often overlooked by European companies.
Maybe that explains from a cultural standpoint the golf course outings here in the US, right? Where it's 4 hours, three, depending on good how you are, of quality time with key decision makers, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And may I just add, always let the customer win. Even if you are 10 times better at, golf, tennis, whatever, let the customer win. Make them feel good.
I'll tell you, I
So,
don't have that problem. Even if I tried, I think
yeah.
this would be real. But maybe since we're on this path of telling some stories here, as much as you're obviously willing to share, but one of your, again, almost 30 years of experience doing this type of work, one success story with a European Dutch or other European company that really stuck with you, where you said, okay, this, I've really left a mark with them. They really get what I'm trying to tell them, and that made them successful in the US.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah. There is one company. I did an intercultural training and they were like, okay, that's nice. But yeah, we just had a good time. And they went over to the US and they came back completely frustrated. Um, Everything, a lot of things had gone wrong. This is the company that had taken their performance review, put it through Google
Yeah.
Translate, and said, "Here you go." So that's when the the training I did that awakened them to the cultural differences. But it wasn't until they actually started working closely together that they were aware of like, oh my goodness, things are different here. And so they involved me much more in setting up their American entity. They had actually hired a CEO who had a Dutch last name, who was born in the Netherlands, but he moved here when he was 10, 11 years old. And they were thinking like, oh, we've got a Dutch CEO. This is going to be great. But when somebody moves from the Netherlands to the US at age 10, the Dutch culture isn't very prominently there. And they started involving me much more. And together we designed the systems and we designed the culture that they wanted because they wanted that Dutch culture. Now, you can't just take the Dutch culture and, poof, have all Americans embrace Dutch culture from day one. So there were small things. Like, for example, they had a few Dutch employees there. When Dutch employees are in the US and they talk to each other, it'd be silly for them to speak English if they both speak Dutch. But small things like having these Dutch employees speak English, but speaking in the Dutch way. So very direct. Manny, I think you didn't do that right. I think that you did that wrong. When the Americans heard the way the Dutch communicated, at first they were like, oh my gosh, this person is going to get fired. But then when they saw they communicate like this and then they go out to lunch together, that's weird because Americans communicate much more indirectly. So there were so many small things we designed where Americans got a taste of Dutch culture and they saw that, communicating very directly, it's much more efficient than having to beat around the bush. And, instead of saying that was a bad presentation, an American would say, oh, that was a really good presentation. But I do have one little thing you could, make it even better where you don't know, was my presentation great or not? So anyway, together they involved me much more in designing systems and just the way things were done. Afterwards, what I heard from the VP of HR is that some employees didn't like the way the Dutch worked and they left. And, yeah, you can't win them all.
Fair.
But a
Yes.
lot of employees loved the way, once they got used to the way that the Dutch worked, they were like, I'm going to stay here. And when a competitor came and offered them $10,000 more to come work for them, they're like, $10,000 is really nice, but I'm so happy here. I love the way we work here that I'm going to stay here. And so their employee retention rates they hardly had any turnover. For example, there was one employee was their manager, the CEO actually noticed that something was wrong. And so this employee said, yeah, you know what? My horse is very, very sick. And so this CEO said, look, you can stay here and work, but I see that your mind is somewhere else. I see that you're really, really worried. Go home, take care of your horse, and, you can do the work later. Just answer your phone if I call you, if I really need you, but just go take care of your horse. But this could have been, in this case, it was a horse, could have been a child. And so this whole work-life balance is also something that is, it's everybody here knows about work-life balance, but to experience it, to be able to go home to take care of your sick child or your sick horse or whatever, it's different. And Americans are like, or tend to be, wow, I like this. And it's such a way to keep your employees happy. So to answer your question, what is a success story? Success story is where a Dutch company was really able to implement the best of American culture and Dutch culture. And you don't just do that from day one, but you very gradually implement things and see how it lands, tweak it a little bit. But that's such a competitive advantage.
I think, yeah, go ahead. Sorry. Didn't mean to.
Yeah. No, to this day, like the VP of HR and I are still in touch, and I still coach people if they have Americans who I coach them, help them understand Dutch culture whenever they send an expat over to the US. Just a few hours of coaching to understand you were successful in the Netherlands. How can you translate that success to the US? You can't just, speak English. You've got to adjust certain things. But the fact that they honor American culture, they honor the Dutch culture, and they were able to take the best of both worlds. And that's just beautiful.
I think that's a perfect time to move to the next segment of the show, which is the core four.
Yeah.
Next up, the core four.
The same four questions that I ask every guest on every episode, and hope obviously that you can share your insights as well. Of course, you can provide certain answers based on your actual work, but I know you're also working with other advisors. You see a bunch of different companies. You see, obviously, different regions in the US as you're advising companies. So a full breadth of knowledge experience here would be fine.
Fire away.
The first of the core four is all about challenges. So what are the biggest challenges European businesses that you see face in the US market, and how do you or others then help them overcome those?
One thing is money. You need a very big bag of money. The salaries here are higher. You need more services. So that is one challenge. I see that European companies just don't budget enough. And so I work with recruiters, and recruiters can say, for example, in the United States, salespeople, they have uncapped bonuses. And so European companies are like, well, we offer our Europeans capped bonuses. Once you hit this bonus, then you can't go any further. So we're going to do that to our we're going to offer the same to our American employees. And then I have to explain that the way life works here, Americans need to take care of themselves. There are no social safety nets. So Americans tend to be much more driven by money. So offering a salesperson a cap bonus, sure, you can do that. But as soon as they reach the top of their bonus, they're like, why should I work more if it's not going to give me any more bonus? So explaining the whole reasoning behind that, behind why do I need a lawyer? I have several companies who don't have a lawyer in the United States, who don't have a US entity, which works perfectly fine if you're doing business internationally in Europe. But again, explaining that the legal system in the US is very different than the legal system in the Netherlands. You don't have all those protections that you have in the Netherlands. That's one of the challenges, explaining why you need this big bag of money. But I think my main challenge, especially for Western European companies, is just being able to speak English isn't enough. Speaking is not the same as communicating. If a Dutch person in the Netherlands, it is perfectly acceptable to be very direct, like I mentioned before, to tell somebody that presentation was not great. If you do that in the United States, your employee is going to run to the bathroom crying, update their LinkedIn, and look for a new job. It's just not acceptable to speak that way. So I think that's my biggest challenge, is making people aware of these cultural differences, because they're so subtle that people don't notice it until they're here and they hit a wall several times. And that's really expensive. You've lost a lot of time, you've lost a lot of employees, and you've lost a lot of potential clients. So even though you think there are no cultural differences, they're small, but they have a huge impact.
Well, from those challenges, usually, supposedly, come some lessons learned, which is the second of the core four. And if you are now thinking about companies, European companies entering the US market for the very first time, if you could give them only one piece of advice, what would it be?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sounding like a broken record. Respect or educate yourself about the cultural differences. I know that I've said this word a million times, but to me that is so core. As Americans would say, we're no longer in Kansas from the movie The Wizard of Oz. You're not in the Netherlands. You're in a different country with different values, different customs, different expectations. Find out what they are and find out how you can bridge those differences and even leverage those differences. That is my advice. And from there, you can talk about the legal system is different, hiring is different. Yeah, you can talk about the differences.
The third of the core four is all about the future and the future outlook. So what do you personally see as trends that are shaping business environment for European companies in the US or for transatlantic business operations?
Global. Everything is becoming more and more global. Things are being outsourced, and the world is becoming a smaller place. And what I'm noticing, for example, I work with, when I work with companies, you've got the older people and the younger people. And I'm noticing the younger people are much more America minded. I'm seeing American culture. Yeah, the influence is reaching a lot further. For example, if I look at a resume from somebody who is older, the Dutch resume will be very much a listing of what they've done. If I get a Dutch resume from somebody who's younger, it's not so much what they've done, but what they've accomplished. And that's very American. So what I'm seeing is the world is getting smaller. People move easily to different countries. So paying attention to, um, or or realizing that you can use these cultural differences to your advantage. Every culture brings something different. Honor it, use it, leverage it. So that's what I'm seeing, that it's becoming much more international. And with that, I'm also seeing that companies are placing much bigger value on employees who have this intercultural knowledge. So you can have the best salesperson ever, but if they don't have this feeling for cultural differences, if they look at somebody from a different culture and say, well, that's stupid, That's not going to get you anywhere. You want somebody who may be less talented at sales, but who can say, that person communicates very differently. What does that mean to me? How can I change my approach? So in the management development and talent management, having this global experience, having this feeling, this respect for cultural differences has become so much more important.
Well, you already shared an actual success story, and the fourth and last question of the four is really all about the success factor. So what do you think sets really successful European companies here in the US apart from the quote unquote not so successful ones, or those that may never reach their full financial potential? Even worse, from those that actually exit the US after a couple of years. And just like you said earlier with some experts, this doesn't work for me. I'm going back to wherever I came from.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many examples. For example, there was a company that had a product that worked great in the Netherlands, but the way, and I'm not going to name the product because then it becomes too obvious
Right.
which company it was. But they were great in the Netherlands, but in the United States, people have different customs when it comes to food and beverage. And they said, our product is wonderful, so we're just going to cut and paste and use it in the United States. And Americans were like, this doesn't meet my needs. So the companies that are successful are the ones, and I've said it a gazillion times, I feel like a broken record, but the ones that really sit back, look at what do Americans appreciate? How do they communicate? What do they expect from an employer? What do they expect from a product? What do they expect from sales? They really take their time, analyze how they can adjust themselves, how they can leverage the differences and implement it and respect it. And once you've implemented it, it's not a done deal. You're constantly going to discover new small differences. Take those differences and use them to your advantage. And I've had so many companies who just cut and paste, translate, and that doesn't work. Understand how things work in the US. You need a lot more money. Your VP of sales is going to have a much higher salary than your Dutch CEO. Don't fight it. Respect it. That's how things are done here.
That's great. And now to make it even more fun, the next segment of the show is rapid fire.
And now, rapid fire. This or that.
This or
Yes.
that. So I'll ask you 6 questions with 2 answer choices, but you can only pick one. And I tried my very best to make it a little closer to home for you.
All right.
Are you ready?
I'm ready. Bring it on.
So question number 1, New York or LA?
Really? I live outside of New York. New York.
That's why I'm asking. Second question, Yankees or Mets?
You know what? Yankees, because I like their uniforms better, but I am not into sports. So this is just based on, I like the uniforms of the Yankees, the pinstripes better than the blue and orange of the Mets.
Oh.
That's what it's based on.
That's a fair assessment. Third question, and now talking a little bit more about maybe yourself, but also what you recommend companies to consider from a cultural aspect. Suit and tie or business casual?
Depending on where you are located and depending on the situation, unless you're on Wall Street, unless you're a banker, business casual. Wall Street bankers and lawyers, I find that they wear more suit and tie, and I am seeing that you're not wearing a suit and tie. I'm assuming you've taken off your tie and your jacket because you're speaking to a European.
No, I got rid of the tie during COVID, so that's also accepted now from a lawyer, I guess. Not in court though, but for the meetings.
Yeah, no, business casual.
Fourth question, email or phone call?
A phone call. Absolutely phone call. So much of the message gets misinterpreted or lost in email. When you write something, you never know how the person on the other side is going to interpret it. In a phone call, it's real, it's live. I tell you something, by your reaction, I'm hearing you interpret it other than I had intended it. So you can avoid so much trouble by picking up the phone and having that conversation because, email, you never know how the person on the other side is going to interpret it.
The fifth of the rapid fire, office or remote work?
Do I have to choose? Can I say hybrid?
Sure. You're the guest. You can say whatever you want.
I was speaking to my neighbor who has to go into the office 3 days a week. And he was saying it's ridiculous because my team is all over the US. So whether I have a Zoom team meeting from my office or a Zoom team meeting from my home office, it doesn't matter. But personally, I like going into the office, just getting out and, connecting with other people.
So hybrid
Okay,
is.
I'll choose office just for the social aspect.
Okay, great. Well, then I might know the answer already to the sixth and final question of the rapid fire. Conference calls or in-person meeting?
In-person meetings. Yeah, no, I think there is so much more, you can connect with people. And especially you said conference call where you don't even see the expressions. There is so much in somebody's expression. Like, if I say, "Hey, Manny, I'm really happy to be here," instead of Manny, I'm really happy to be here. That's just in how people are. No, I'm all for face to face in person.
That wraps up the rapid fire. And now we're getting into the final closing segment of the show. And I'd like to get also a little more about your cultural experiences. So, as you're thinking back now, maybe your first impression of doing business in America or any culture shock experiences that you personally had and you're willing to share with the audience.
Yeah. Um, so I lived here as a teenager. I moved to the US knowing very little English. And my first day of school, I spoke to somebody who said, "Oh, I'm also Dutch." And I'm like, "Oh, great. I can speak Dutch." So I started speaking Dutch. And this person just kind of looked at me and was like, "Oh, what kind of gibberish is that?" And afterwards, somebody had to explain to me that when an American says, "I'm also Dutch," it doesn't mean that they are fresh off the plane from Amsterdam. It means they are of Dutch heritage, meaning their great grandfather came from the Netherlands. So that's something when somebody says, "I'm Dutch, I'm French, I'm German," doesn't mean that they speak Dutch, French, German. That was one of the big culture shocks. Yeah. And the other big culture shock is in the Netherlands, very little hierarchy. You can actually disagree with your boss. And one of the first meetings here in the US, I disagreed with my boss and I could see the rest of the room. "Oh, what's going on?" They were like, you could feel the energy go like, "Oh, what's wrong?" And fortunately, I had a German coworker who after the meeting took me aside and said, "You do not disagree with the boss in public." Yeah. Kind of strained the relationship with my boss for a long time.
So maybe not so much of a fun culture shock experience, but yes,
Yeah.
that's part of it, right? And that actually shows how important it is for companies to appreciate the cultural training.
Exactly. Exactly. It's such a little investment that has such a big payout.
Have you picked up any American habits over the years where you say, "Oh my God, I'm Americanizing now," whether it's cultural or otherwise?
Yes, I have. Yeah, and it's funny you say that because I was in the Netherlands last week, and I met somebody, and afterwards I heard, "Well, that person thought you were so American." Well, I think I'm so Dutch, but we were in a restaurant, and in the United States, servers in a restaurant are paid less. They work for tips, so they're all smiles. "How are you?" And we were in a restaurant and we weren't getting this, the waiter just wasn't taking our order. And so finally I called the waiter over and I said, "Can you please take our order?" And the waiter said, "Well, let me just finish cleaning that table next to you and then I'll take your order." And I said, "No, we've been waiting for a long time. Take our order now." And my Dutch friends were all like, So yes, this level of service that I expect, and my Dutch friends would say it demands. That's one thing that I have unknowingly really internalized that I expect higher levels of service. And the other thing is, I live in New York. This may be, you're in Houston, which in New York, the pace is very fast, especially compared to the South in Houston. Like everything goes like this. So when I flew back for security, I was put in this one line and I had waited in the line for 5 minutes. And then all the women were this was in Amsterdam, all the women were taken out of the line because they only had male agents there. So we had to go to the back of the line. And I was like, This is ridiculous. I've just been waiting in line for 5 minutes. You can't do this. You at least have to put me in front of the line with the, And the Dutch person behind me was like, calm down, it's not the end of the world. And that's when I realized, ooh, I've become a true New Yorker. I want everything to go fast. Yeah. So that's a habit I've picked up.
Well, as you said early on in the discussion, time is money, right?
There you go. Exactly. Well, I mean, I was pretty early for my flight, so it wasn't like I had stuff to do. But that also shows very much that, in New York, the pace is so fast. And I recently traveled to Atlanta and, I'm used to security going fast, 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 everybody pushing, everybody shoving. And in Atlanta, in the airport, they played calming music and everybody lined up and, things were so calm. I could feel my blood pressure go down. So even within the United States, there are very big cultural differences.
Very true. And of course, as we know now, you're helping the European companies do business here in the US. But is there one thing that maybe American businesses could learn from European business culture?
Absolutely. When I speak to Americans who work with the Dutch or who have moved to the Netherlands, there's so many Americans who've moved to the Netherlands and were like, I'm not coming back. Love the work-life balance. I mentioned the example of, the person whose horse was sick and where the boss said, go home and take care of your horse. This whole work-life balance, turning off your phone at 6 p.m. It's very frustrating, with the time differences. So you've got to really, have some processes there. But I think Europeans balancing work-life is so much healthier. And it really makes work
Coming from a New Yorker.
coming from exactly. But being able to say, you know what, today I have a sick child, I'm going to stay home. Or, you know what, today I'm going to go home at 5 o'clock because I have a yoga class at 6 o'clock. Having that be acceptable really changes the whole atmosphere. Now, of course, you don't want to take that too far, where, for example, in Europe, in Sweden, all of Sweden tends to be closed, mid-July to mid-August. And in the United States, business goes on. People take very little vacation. So that's taking it a little bit too far. And I heard of Swedish companies who have lost business because of this, because, the Americans couldn't reach them in July. And yeah, because everybody was on vacation. But in the United States, business goes on, whether it's July or September. But this, adding a little bit more work-life balance, more vacation days, less pressure of always being on, answering your phone or taking that one meeting when you're on vacation. I think Americans can learn a lot from that European trend.
So then, as you're reflecting on your career of helping these European companies, all making it big in America, of
Yeah.
course, what's one thing or something or a few key aspects that make it fun for you? Like what drives your passion and helping those European companies?
What drives my passion? Think Europe and the US are two continents, countries that I feel very connected with, that I enjoy, that I love. So bringing those two together, it's just a lot of fun. Also it's like, seeing companies grow and seeing them succeed and it's like, seeing children grow up and being successful, seeing these companies taking their first steps in the US and then becoming successful. That's just so much fun. And that's the thing, like most people are like, oh, Sunday night, I don't want to go to work. But for me, I enjoy what I'm doing. I love my weekends, but I love Monday morning as well, because it's so much fun to see these results and being able to take two things that I love and turn it into work.
Well, I have to confess, you did convince me, but you also didn't have to convince me because I already understand the importance about acknowledging and appreciating the cultural differences because it squarely falls within preventable legal problems, especially in employment law realms
Yeah.
in the US
Yes.
here. But if I am now a listener, a viewer of the show and want to get in touch with you, how can they reach you?
I have two websites. So specifically for the Dutch, I have DutchAmericanConnection.com. You can reach me there. But I also have a website for anybody doing business in the United States, and that is americanculturecode.com. And if you go to my websites, that's where you'll find me, and you'll find an overview of my services. And on the Dutch American Connection website, you'll find my blogs with lots of tips and stories, success stories, and not so success stories. But you can learn a lot there from my blogs on how to do business with Americans.
Obviously, we'll put links in the show notes. Another question that I like to ask at the very end is, do you have a personal quote or motto that guides you in business and in life?
Absolutely. And, I have 3 children. I just spoke to one of my children, and, they're so sick and tired of me hearing them say, it's okay to make a mistake as long as you learn from your mistake. And that is such an American thing. Americans take risk. It is perfectly fine to fail as long as you get up and learn from your failure and try again. And that is my life motto. Like, you can, oh my goodness, I failed. Oh, the world's going to end. Or you can say, I failed because of this, this, and this. So let's do it again. But take those lessons learned.
Fail forward is what I call it.
Fail forward, yes. And my children were born here in the United States and went through the American school system. And one thing that they learn is that the word fail, it's spelled F-A-I-L. It stands for first attempt in learning. So taking a failure and not seeing it as the end of the world, I'm stupid, but seeing it as it's just another lesson learned. That changes everything. And I think that's very much the American mindset. Like, just try it. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, do it again, but differently.
Annette, at the very end, speaking with a lawyer, there's always a catch-all opportunity. In a deposition, you should never ask that question, but on a podcast, I'm allowed to do that. Is there anything else you'd like to share? Anything else you want to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I mean, I've said it a million times. Like, these cultural differences, even though they're not visible, like when you go to China, boom, they're visible. When you go to the US, they're not visible. They're not noticeable. They are there, and they're really small, but they have a huge impact. And when I say huge, I mean financial. They're going to cost you a lot of dollars. So educate yourself on the cultural differences and how you can use them to your advantage.
Thank you very much for joining me, for joining us today. It was a lot of fun. I always learn new aspects of business, but I, as a lawyer, cannot stress the importance enough of understanding the cultural differences, the transatlantic cultural differences, but also the similarities and appreciating it. I appreciate your time. I appreciate obviously everything that you do to educate European companies on how to make it big in America. I wish you personally and your 2 companies nothing but the best for the future, and I hope we'll be able to do this again in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And I know this is the ending, but I love how you said also appreciate the similarities, because that's very important and that's going to connect you. But it's the differences where the gold is. That's where you can really make a difference. So thank you so much for this opportunity. And look forward to staying in touch and working together.
Till next time, Annette, thank you very much. That was the show. Wait. Before you go, if you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss the next one. And if you have thoughts, questions, or topics you'd like me to cover, drop a comment. I read every single one. If you're serious about entering or scaling in the US market, head over to masteringmarketentry.com or mannyschoenhuber.com for more insights and resources. Thanks for listening, and until next time, go out there and make it big in America.